When the United States entered the First World War in April of 1917, most German soldiers did not panic. Many believed it was too late. Russia was collapsing, France was exhausted, Britain was stretched thin, and the war had already devoured millions. To the men in German trenches, America was distant, inexperienced, and untested. Few imagined that soldiers from across the Atlantic, men who had never lived in trenches, never endured years of artillery fire, would soon become one of the most unsettling forces they would face. But as the months passed, a quiet realization spread through German lines. This was not just another army arriving. This was something different, something frighteningly new. German observers began to notice it first in the rear areas: endless trains, unloading equipment, fresh uniforms, new rifles, artillery pieces that fired relentlessly without concern for ammunition shortages. Unlike the weary European armies, the Americans seemed untouched by exhaustion. German soldiers, hardened by years of attrition warfare, watched with disbelief as wave after wave of American troops arrived, well-fed, confident, and equipped as if the war had only just begun. For men who had been fighting since 1914, the psychological effect was devastating. The enemy was no longer weakening. The enemy was growing stronger. That shock intensified when Americans finally entered direct combat. During the Meuse-Argonne offensive in 1918, German machine gun crews were accustomed to holding off assaults through discipline and firepower. But something unexpected happened. Attacks continued even after heavy losses. German soldiers reported that American infantry advanced aggressively, using coordinated rifle fire, grenades, and suppressive tactics that felt unfamiliar. When Sergeant Alvin York's unit was ambushed, German machine gunners expected the usual outcome: a stalled attack and retreat. Instead, they witnessed a single American rifleman methodically eliminating gun positions with uncanny accuracy. As German soldiers surrendered by the dozens, many later admitted they had never seen anything like it. It wasn't just York's marksmanship that stunned them. It was the realization that American soldiers were trained to exploit technology and terrain with terrifying efficiency. Similar disbelief spread among German units facing the Harlem Hellfighters. German patrols operating in the Argonne forest were used to probing weak points and capturing isolated sentries, but when they encountered Henry Johnson, the engagement defied expectations. Grenades failed to stop him. Rifle fire did not break his defense. Even after running out of ammunition, Johnson continued fighting with a bayonet and knife, refusing to surrender. German soldiers later described the encounter not as bravery alone, but as something deeply unsettling. These Americans did not fight like men hoping to survive. They fought like men determined to dominate the battlefield at any cost.
At Cantigny, German officers initially dismissed the American attack as symbolic, a limited action meant to boost morale. But as the assault unfolded, German defenders realized their mistake. American artillery preparation was precise, communications held under pressure. Counterattacks that would normally break inexperienced troops failed again and again. German soldiers began to notice a pattern. The Americans adapted quickly. Where older armies relied on habit and doctrine, the Americans adjusted tactics in real time, using modern coordination between infantry, artillery, and machine guns. To German veterans, this flexibility was alarming. It suggested an army learning faster than it could be countered. By the time the Meuse-Argonne campaign expanded into the largest American operation of the war, the mood inside German ranks had changed completely. Soldiers spoke less about victory and more about endurance. They noticed that American artillery never seemed to fall silent, that losses were replaced with unsettling speed, that even after brutal casualties, new American units arrived, fresh and determined. determined. For German troops already drained by years of war, this was the breaking point. The realization settled in quietly but firmly. Germany was no longer fighting nations at the edge of collapse. It was fighting an industrial giant that could absorb losses and continue forward without hesitation. German prisoners taken during these final months often shared the same reaction. They were not shocked by American courage alone, but by American capacity. The scale of supplies, the abundance of equipment, the constant flow of troops, all pointed to a war that Germany could no longer win. Technology, logistics, and industrial power had merged into a single overwhelming force. What frightened German soldiers most was not the violence of combat, but the sense of inevitability. No matter how well they fought, the Americans would keep coming. In the trenches, amid mud, rats, gas attacks, and constant shelling, this realization weighed heavily. The war had changed, not with a single decisive battle, but with the arrival of an enemy who fought with modern tools, modern coordination, and unshaken confidence. General John J. Pershing's insistence on keeping American forces independent only reinforced this impression. German commanders could no longer predict how Americans would fight, and unpredictability in war breeds fear. By late 1918, many German soldiers understood the truth long before politicians did. The entry of the United States had altered the balance irreversibly. American technology, logistics, and manpower had not just strengthened the Entente, they had shattered German hopes of outlasting their enemies. The shock was not sudden, but cumulative, and when the armistice finally came, it confirmed what German troops had already learned in the trenches. Once America entered the war, the outcome was no longer in doubt. As American forces spread across the Western Front, German soldiers began to talk among themselves, not loudly, not openly, but in quiet conversations during rare moments of rest. The word that appeared again and again was not fear, but endless. The Americans seemed endless. Unlike British or French units that had been fighting for years and showed visible signs of exhaustion, American troops arrived with clean uniforms, modern equipment, and an energy that felt unnatural in a war defined by fatigue. To German veterans hardened by 4 years of trench warfare, this was deeply unsettling. German intelligence officers quickly realized that American strength was not limited to individual bravery or isolated technological advantages. It was systemic. American artillery units fired with a consistency that suggested limitless supply. German counter-battery fire, once effective, struggled to silence guns that could be replaced and repositioned with alarming speed. Soldiers at the front noticed that even when American attacks failed, they returned soon after, better organized and better supported. This adaptability stood in sharp contrast to German units that were increasingly bound by shortages, rigid doctrine, and declining morale. One of the most disturbing realizations for German troops was how quickly American soldiers learned trench warfare. Early encounters had given German defenders some confidence. The Americans were inexperienced, sometimes reckless, and unfamiliar with the rhythms of the front. But this advantage vanished quickly. Within months, German soldiers observed that American patrols moved more cautiously, coordinated better with artillery, and used suppressive fire in ways that mirrored and sometimes improved upon European methods. This rapid learning curve suggested something far more dangerous than raw enthusiasm, an army capable of evolving faster than its enemy. Captured German soldiers often described their surprise during interrogations. Many expected Americans to fight cautiously, protecting their own lives above all else. Instead, they reported attacks marked by determination and momentum.
American units pressed forward even under intense machine gun fire, supported by artillery that responded rapidly to requests from the front. For German defenders used to exploiting hesitation and fatigue, this relentless pressure was demoralizing. Each engagement chipped away at the belief that experience alone could defeat a newcomer. The psychological effect extended beyond the trenches. German officers tasked with planning defensive operations faced an increasingly grim reality. American logistics made traditional German strategies ineffective. Attrition had once favored Germany's ability to endure longer than its enemies. Now the Americans had reversed the equation. German supply lines faltered while American depots expanded. Rail networks carried men and materiel with astonishing efficiency. For the first time, German planners confronted an enemy whose industrial capacity dwarfed their own and whose homeland remained untouched by war.
German artillery officers noted another troubling detail. American batteries fired with less concern for conservation. Shells fell in steady barrages that seemed designed not only to destroy positions, but to break morale. Trenches shook relentlessly, dugouts collapsed. German soldiers began to associate American artillery with psychological exhaustion as much as physical destruction. The sound itself became a warning, a signal that another push was coming and that resistance would only delay the inevitable. Air power added another layer of unease. German pilots, many of them seasoned veterans, noticed a shift in the air war by 1918. American pilots were aggressive, sometimes recklessly so, but backed by increasing numbers and reliable aircraft. German aces who had survived years of combat now faced opponents who were less predictable and increasingly numerous. Losses that once could be absorbed now felt irreplaceable. Each American squadron added pressure to a system already stretched thin. German soldiers taken prisoner during the Meuse-Argonne offensive often expressed disbelief at the scale of American involvement. They described supply depots filled with food, ammunition, and medical equipment beyond anything they had seen. Wounded American soldiers were evacuated quickly, treated efficiently, and often returned to duty. For German troops accustomed to dwindling rations and overburdened medical stations, this contrast was stark. The Americans were not just fighting, they were sustaining the fight indefinitely. Perhaps the most damaging realization came slowly, over weeks rather than days. German soldiers understood that even if they won individual battles, it would not matter. Each victory cost irreplaceable men. Each defeat was quickly corrected by fresh American units. The war had shifted from a contest of endurance to a contest of production, and Germany was losing. This understanding spread quietly through the ranks, undermining morale more effectively than any propaganda. German officers recorded in their diaries a growing sense of strategic paralysis. Defensive lines could be planned, but holding them became increasingly difficult. American attacks were supported by detailed reconnaissance, coordinated artillery, and flexible infantry tactics. When one approach failed, another followed. For commanders accustomed to predictable patterns, this adaptability was a nightmare. The Americans did not fight like an army shaped by tradition. They fought like an army shaped by possibility. By late 1918, the presence of American forces affected even sectors where they were not directly engaged. German units redeployed to counter American advances, weakening other fronts. The ripple effect spread across the Western Front, accelerating Germany's decline. Soldiers sensed this shift instinctively. Conversations turned from victory to survival, from strategy to resignation. The Americans had not just joined the war, they had transformed it. When the armistice finally arrived, many German soldiers were not surprised.
The outcome had become clear months earlier in the trenches, on the roads clogged with American supply columns, and in the skies filled with unfamiliar aircraft. The shock of American technology and organization lingered long after the guns fell silent. It reshaped military thinking across Europe and left an indelible mark on those who had witnessed it firsthand. For German veterans, the memory endured not as hatred, but as awe mixed with defeat. They had faced an enemy who arrived late, learned fast, and brought with him the full weight of a modern industrial nation. The First World War did not end because of a single battle or a single weapon. It ended because the balance of power shifted irreversibly, and German soldiers were among the first to recognize it.
As the summer of 1918 turned into autumn, German soldiers no longer spoke about the Americans as a future problem. They spoke about them as a present reality. The initial curiosity had vanished. The disbelief had hardened into certainty. Wherever American units appeared, the character of the battlefield changed. Attacks became faster, artillery preparation more intense, and pressure constant. German defenders noticed that American forces did not pause for long periods. There was little of the stagnation that had defined the war for years. Momentum itself had become a weapon. German non-commissioned officers began reporting something deeply troubling. American units did not behave like armies nearing the end of a long war. They behaved like an army at the beginning of one. Their discipline was strict, but not brittle. Their morale was high, not forced. When losses occurred, replacements arrived quickly, unfamiliar with the fear that years of trench warfare had instilled in European soldiers. This created a dangerous asymmetry. German troops carried the weight of 4 years of suffering. American troops carried expectation. In German rear areas, the effect was just as severe. Supply officers struggled to meet demands with dwindling resources, while reports described American depots overflowing with equipment. Rail yards, once sufficient for German needs, now felt inadequate. The contrast was impossible to ignore. German soldiers understood instinctively what this meant. The war was no longer about courage or endurance. It was about which nation could sustain modern warfare longer. And in that contest, the United States was unmatched. Medical officers recorded another alarming difference. American wounded were evacuated efficiently, treated quickly, and returned to duty when possible. German medical stations, overwhelmed and undersupplied, could not offer the same. Soldiers noticed. Morale eroded further as men realized that survival itself depended increasingly on chance. The Americans, by contrast, seemed protected by systems designed to preserve fighting strength. This was not just technology on the battlefield, it was technology supporting every layer of war. German artillery crews felt the pressure constantly. American counter-battery fire was accurate and persistent. Positions carefully concealed were located and neutralized. This suggested a level of coordination and intelligence gathering that German forces could no longer match. The sense of being watched, of being measured and corrected, unsettled even veteran troops. It reinforced the idea that American warfare was methodical, patient, and ultimately overwhelming. German pilots, once confident masters of the sky, faced a similar reckoning. Fuel shortages limited training. Replacement aircraft were scarce. Meanwhile, American squadrons grew in number and competence. Air superiority was no longer contested in the traditional sense. It was slipping away, gradually, quietly, but decisively. For soldiers on the ground, this loss of control added another layer of vulnerability. The battlefield no longer felt bounded. Danger came from above as much as ahead. Among German prisoners of war, a pattern emerged during interrogations. Few expressed hatred toward American soldiers. Many expressed confusion. They described an enemy who seemed wealthy in resources, confident in purpose, and unconcerned with losses in a way that felt alien. Several remarked that Americans fought as if they expected to win, a subtle but powerful distinction. Hope, German soldiers realized too late, had become an American advantage. German officers were forced to confront an uncomfortable truth. Years of tactical brilliance and discipline could not compensate for material inferiority. Plans became defensive, reactive, and increasingly desperate. Even successful engagements failed to change the broader situation. American pressure resumed elsewhere. The front bent, then cracked. Orders became harder to enforce as belief in victory faded. By October 1918, many German units were fighting not for success, but for survival and dignity. The presence of American forces loomed over every decision. Soldiers understood that the war's outcome had already been decided far from the trenches, in factories, shipyards, rail networks, and training camps across the Atlantic. The battlefield was merely where that decision became visible. When the armistice was signed, German soldiers laid down their weapons with a mixture of relief and resignation. For many, the decisive moment had not been a single defeat, but a gradual realization months earlier. The Americans had changed the nature of the war, not through cruelty or terror, but through capacity, through scale, through modernity. In the years that followed, German military thinkers studied American methods carefully. They recognized that future wars would not be won solely by bravery or tradition. They would be won by nations capable of integrating technology, industry, and human effort into a single coherent force. The First World War had revealed this truth painfully, and the United States had embodied it. For the German soldiers who faced them, the shock of American technology was not just a wartime experience, it was a lesson about the future of warfare, one they would remember long after the trenches were abandoned and the guns fell silent. The Great War ended in 1918, but the realization it produced would echo for decades. When America entered the conflict, it did not merely tip the balance, it redefined what power meant in the modern world. And for those who stood on the other side of that transformation, the moment it became clear was unforgettable.